So, when I was in middle school, we used to have this thing here at youth. I grew up here at Northview, so I went to our middle school youth. And one of the events that was highly looked forward to was an event called Yuck Night. And I don't know if you've had kids who grew up with that, you'll know what it's about. But basically, there used to be a field in that part that's now a parking lot, and we would go out there and basically get as dirty as possible. So there was events that you're throwing eggs around, there's flour, there's pudding, all of the things, just this big mess. And as a middle school student, you love it, it's the greatest. And you end the night off like, oh, let's jump in this mud pit that's hot water, but you're not, it's just filthy. So we go to this event, we have the time of our life getting as dirty as possible. But then comes like pickup time and go home and go to bed. My mother was appalled, and I was forbidden from ever going again. But the process of getting clean was horrendous. I was dirty, defiled, and she's like, no, you're not even coming in the house till you're hosed down. And then you're not getting anywhere near your bed until you are so cleaned. And I could not even clean my hair myself. She's working through it, getting out these pudding and egg pieces with a comb. It was disgusting, right? I needed help. I needed to be cleaned before I could get near my bed. But what if I just, ignored all that and just jumped right on into my bed, and that dirtiness would have just spread, right? And it would be ridiculous. It's so obvious. I am unclean. I am filthy. I need to be clean. So Israel, too, in our chapters, has this obvious need for cleansing. And I think in this text, they finally are starting to get it. They're starting to see the desperate state that they're in, and they need someone to purify and cleanse them. God has been showing them since he rescued them from Egypt and throughout the book of Numbers, he is holy, you are not, but here is the way to be near me. You can't come near me in your defiled, dirty state, but you can if you follow the rules, if you are made clean. And we have this same need as well. So we're going to see how these chapters teach us about our need to be clean and what God does to provide for us. It brings us up to these three chapters that are really closely linked with what we studied last week. So it was helpful that hopefully in your groups you kind of blasted through last week's lesson and this week's. You got kind of that fresh in your minds, what happened in Numbers 15 and 16, and then into Numbers 17 through 19. I think these chapters are linked around the verses in Numbers 17, verses 12 through 13. The people respond when God shows Aaron as his priest. The people respond saying, "Behold, we perish. We are undone. We are all undone. Everyone who comes near to the tabernacle of the Lord shall die. Are we all to perish?" And so they finally, it's like they get their danger and their uncleanness and their problem, that they are unclean and they cannot come near the tabernacle of the Lord, or they shall die. This thing that God's been teaching them this whole time, that they need to obey his commands. They need to obey the leaders he's put in place. They need to worship him properly. They need to be holy because he is holy. And as defiled people, they're unable to approach him. So he's been teaching them that they need an advocate. They need someone to intercede for them. And they're finally in a place where they understand their problem. And they're actually crying out, searching for an answer to their need, because they see the consequences of God's wrath all around them, right? In chapter 16, 14,000 people died. They see death around them. They're panicking. They're unclean, and they can't get close to God without perishing. I think we all kind of need to get to that state, that understanding of our own sin and defilement, or we're never going to look for someone to save us. And so the big idea of this passage is that God's priest and purification protect us from perishing. So we're going to tackle each of these three chapters one by one, bringing them all back to how they connect to this problem and God's solution. So we're going to look at 3 points: trust your priest, pay your pastors, and live purified. Our first point, trust your priest. So Israel did not trust their priest. They did not trust their leader that God had set up for them, and they keep pushing back against him. That's what we saw especially in chapter 16 with Korah and his rebellion and the people saying, all the people are holy, we all can do the things. We don't trust that Aaron is the one to do it, that the priesthood is his. They're saying that everyone should be able to draw near to God. And God responds to that rebellion by proving Aaron is his chosen man. The other 250 men who came with those censers are burned up from a fire from heaven. And it's only Aaron's atonement, his censer, that stops that plague from killing everyone. So Aaron was clearly God's choice in chapter 16. And then in Numbers 17, we see that God actually initiates the next test, the next thing that's going to prove that Aaron is his choice. It's kind of like coming on the heels of those stories, God says, okay, everyone, get your bid in, and I will show you once and for all who I have called. It's like almost a recount of an election. It's like people are, I'm not really sure, is he the one? And so they recount, it's confirming this is the guy God has chosen. But in this test, which you read about in 17, it's better than a recount because there's no place for human error in this. So all the tribes are supposed to come. Their chief brings his staff, right? He brings it, and it's got his name on it, so we know whose it is. And they bring all the staffs, and Aaron's staff as well among them. And they put it in the tent of meeting. And they leave it overnight. No one goes in there. This is a completely divine miracle. There's no bias. There's no way to sway the vote. There's no way to mess up the count. This is going to be God alone. And so we read Numbers 17, 8 through 10. On the next day, Moses went into the tent of testimony, and behold, the staff of Aaron for the house of Levi had sprouted and put forth buds and produced blossoms, and it bore ripe almonds. Then Moses brought out all the staffs from the Lord to all the people, and they looked, and each man took his staff. And the Lord said to Moses, put back the staff of Aaron before the testimony, to be kept as a sign for the rebels, that you may make an end of their grumblings against me, lest they die. So God has provided, again, this confirmation. Aaron is the priest. Staffs don't bud, never mind produce almonds by themselves overnight, right? This is a clear miracle. It's clearly the Lord. They could never say, well, Moses, you just decided you wanted your brother to have this high position. They could never do that. This was clear. God was choosing them. And again, we see God sets up a sign for future generations, and he says it's kept a sign for them so that they stop grumbling and so that they don't die. Aaron will be the man. Aaron's descendants will make atonement for them. They will be the priests. We looked a little bit in Exodus 28 and 29, and we saw that Aaron and his sons had been chosen long ago for this priesthood. They were consecrated. It was clear that God had given them this job as a statute forever. And again, he is saying, I'm not going to accept anyone else. You've seen the evidence. You've seen the staff. This is my man. And so in the same way, today, there is only one high priest before God who he accepts to intercede and atone for us. There's only one who makes us pure. What we learn about the uniqueness, the importance, the weight, and responsibility of the priesthood in Numbers helps us understand Jesus, our high priest, even more. Because like Israel, that danger they were facing, that fear they were facing about not being able to draw near God because of their uncleanness, we are in the same state of defilement and uncleanness. We also need that problem to be solved. So the New Testament author of the book of Hebrews picks up and discusses a lot of Old Testament things and teaches us what they mean for today. And so we're going to be in Hebrews. You've probably noticed we've been in Hebrews a lot in your gospel connections. So today we'll be in that book in a few places as well. So Hebrews 5 says this and connects Jesus to Aaron because like Aaron, Jesus was appointed. So Hebrews 5, 4 through 6 says, no priest, takes this honor of priesthood upon himself, but only when called by God, just as Aaron was. So also Christ did not exalt himself to be made a high priest, but was appointed by him who said, you are my son, today I have begotten you. And he says also in another place, you are a priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek. So I'm not going to go into the Melchizedek comment. Basically there, it's pointing to Jesus isn't a priest in the line of Aaron. He's a priest according to a different order. But the point is that he was called and appointed. He was chosen directly by God, not by anyone else, just as Aaron was chosen by God. He is the high priest chosen and designated by God, but he's not just another Aaron. He is a better Aaron. So what makes him better? What makes him better than this man who could run out and literally stop a plague, stop people from dying on the right side from his left? How is Jesus better? We're going to read in Hebrews 7. Jesus is better because he is permanent and he's the only one. Hebrews 7:23 through 28 says, the former priests were many in number because they were prevented by death from continuing in office. But he, Jesus, holds his priesthood permanently because he continues forever. Consequently, he is able to save to the uttermost those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. Right? So Aaron was only able to save those who, other than the 14,000, but Jesus saves to the uttermost all who draw to him. And he's the only one. Aaron is going to die, but Jesus never will die. And then in verse 26, it continues, for it was indeed fitting that we should have such a high priest in Jesus, holy, innocent, unstained, separated from sinners, and exalted above the heavens. He has no need, like those high priests, to offer sacrifices daily, first for his own sins and then for those of the people, since he did this once for all when he offered up himself. For the law appoints men in their weakness as high priests, but the word of the oath, which came later than the law, appoints a son who has been made perfect forever. So Jesus is better than Aaron. He is our high priest who is holy, innocent, unstained, and separate. He's exalted above the heavens. He's the king. And he sacrificed once for all. It's not a continual thing he has to do. So his sacrifice was better. His atonement was better. And it says he was made perfect forever. No priest could ever claim that. And finally, Jesus gives us a better covenant. Aaron and his line of priests mediated the old covenant, the law, and God's promises to Israel. But in Hebrews 8, it talks about how Jesus is better because he is the minister of a better covenant, the new covenant in his blood. The law couldn't actually save them, but Jesus' blood saves. They could never be clean enough to draw near to God, the average person. And yet, Jesus is able to save forever and says that he draws us near. The very thing the Israelites were terrified to do, we are welcomed to do because of our high priest. This new covenant he ministers is the gospel. It's that Jesus, the Son of God, came to earth, lived and died for our sins, bore the weight of our iniquities, and his blood and broken body atone for your sin, so that we through faith can have eternal life with him, be resurrected, be glorified. If you confess your sins and believe, you'll be saved. That's the new covenant in him. So much better. Our priest is incredible. We can trust him. So what do we do with this? So what? Trust your priest and, well, like God said to Moses, he showed them their priest and he said, this is my man, so stop grumbling. Stop whining against me. He says, I will make to cease from me the grumblings of the people. And he tells Moses, use this staff to remind them to stop grumbling against me. And so we also need to stop grumbling. This recurring theme in Numbers, right? This grumble, this complaining. They are headed to their promised land, and yet they grumble all the time. They are being given the best, and yet they grumble. It's like you're on your way to a paid trip to Disneyland, and you're whining about the hours on the plane. Like, it doesn't make sense. And so what are we grumbling about? Israel grumbled about the rules, their leaders, the food, the land, and it showed their hearts didn't trust God. It didn't trust their priest. But God provided the answer and the solution, the promise, the one who would bring them in. And so for us, he provides. So do I trust him, or do my complaints show that I think he's not quite got it all together, that he doesn't quite have my best interest in mind? What complaints do you need to silence in the face of your high priest being trustworthy? One of my big complaints was about really wanting a spouse, wanting to be married. I dated someone really seriously, was going to get married at about 22, and then tragically, out of nowhere, he broke it off, and I didn't know why. And so that brought me into several years of complaining, because I said, God, I feel like I've done everything that you've asked, and this isn't how it's supposed to go. And so I saw God in a certain way, and his leadership in a certain way, and Jesus not giving me what I thought, and I complained about the state that he had me in all the time, wanting my own way. But if I had trusted fully, I can lay those complaints aside and trust that what he has for me and the time he has for me and the plan is better. I can respond in humility and thanksgiving instead of grumbling when I realize what my priest has truly done in his goodness. And secondly, we don't need to fear. Judgment is not coming on you if you have faith in him. The Israelites were terrified that any who drew near the tabernacle would die. They were missing the point that if they had obeyed God and trusted their priest, they had nothing to fear. God was providing a way for them to dwell in his midst without perishing. And your high priest isn't going anywhere. He is able to save to the uttermost, and he always lives to make intercession for you. He is continually there at the Father's side. His atonement is lasting. Growing up, I often would suddenly get scared that maybe my salvation wasn't secure, and I was scared of hell, and I was scared of not being with God or my family, and so I'd pray the prayer again and again and again and again. But I think it's not just a kid thing that sometimes comes up, and we wonder, is it really true? Am I really going to be saved? We read these things about God's wrath and his judgment, and maybe fear kind of comes up in us. But if you are saved, sister, trust your priest. He always lives to atone for you. There's nothing you can do to separate yourself from him. You will never be cut off. So trust your priest. Secondly, the next chapter, it was Numbers 18, and I entitled this one, Pay Your Pastors. So remember the problem? All who draw near are perishing. This is the problem that people are dealing with. And so God has provided Aaron, and now he's moving on and also reminding them that he's provided the priests and the Levites as guard duty. So he has made a way for some to draw near to him and for all to draw near through the work of the priests and the Levites. God is protecting people from his wrath by setting the priests as guards over their priesthood and the holy place, the tabernacle, and the Levites guard the whole tent, and they guard people from the priests. So the people don't need to fear if they obey the rules and listen to these guards. It's interesting to note that we already have learned a bit about these people, right? We've seen the census of the Levites. We saw that their jobs were already in place. We saw that they were given guard duty in Numbers 8, so that no plague would come on the people. What the new part is in chapter 18 is seen in verse 1. It says, So the Lord said to Aaron, You and your sons and your father's house with you shall bear iniquity connected with the sanctuary, and you and your sons shall bear iniquity connected with your priesthood. So God is placing the iniquity and the responsibility and the weight of protection upon these people, that if people transgress it, it's their lives on the line. They are the guards. They are the ones set in place to protect. Verse 5 says that these guards are in place so that there never again will be wrath on the whole people of Israel for someone transgressing and coming against the tabernacle. It's on the Levites and the priests to protect this. This is their job. They are carrying this heavy weight of protecting all of the people by keeping them from transgressing the Lord. So if someone attempts to transgress these boundaries, like Korah, he was a Levite, so he's allowed in and doing a whole bunch of stuff, but if he comes in and tries to take on the priestly role, the priests have to stop him. That's their job. They need to stop him, and that person will bear the weight of their transgression, but the whole nation won't fall into sin because of one person's transgression. It will be on the priest to protect from that. We saw an example of this in the King Uzziah, if you got to the Gospel Connections last week. King Uzziah was a king in Jerusalem. He had lots of accomplishments, did great things, but then later in his life, he became prideful. He's like, I am so great, God's blessing me, I should be able to get into the temple and do the stuff the priest does, because God obviously loves me, and in my pride, he went in, tried to take on the role of the priests. And who stops him in that moment? 2 Chronicles 26, 17 through 18 says, Azariah the priest went in after him with 80 priests of the Lord who were men of valor. And they withstood King Uzziah and said, It is not for you, Uzziah, to burn incense to the Lord, but for the priests, the sons of Aaron, who are consecrated to burn incense. Go out of the sanctuary, for you have done wrong, and it will bring you no honor from the Lord. So these priests took their job seriously. They knew it was their role, and they went in and stopped him. They were men of valor, courageous, to stand up against the king himself and tell him, this isn't your job. This is what God has called us to do. So in a similar way, God has appointed people over his people now. He has appointed elders and pastors over the church. We discussed this earlier as well in the connection a few weeks ago. Pastors, elders, shepherds, ministers are to protect the people, the flock, and they protect the doctrine of the church. In Acts 20, verse 28 through 30, Paul is addressing elders of a church, and he's saying, this is what you're supposed to do. Pay attention to yourselves and to all the flock in which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers, to care for the church of God, which he obtained with his own blood. I know that after my departure, fierce wolves will come in among you, not sparing the flock, and from your own selves will arise men, speaking twisted things, to draw away the disciples after them. So our pastors and elders, like priests and Levites, serve and carry a weight of guard duty for us, for the church. They have a weight on them. They're tasked with protecting the flock and protecting the doctrine. It says they have to fight off these wolves. They have to guard against the twisted things people are going to say that's going to draw the flock away. They need to keep everyone protected within the boundaries. And when they serve the church faithfully, we, the church, are blessed through their care and protection. And just as in Numbers, God followed up his provision of this guard duty, these priests and Levites, he followed that up with a discussion about what the priests and Levites get, the contributions and the offerings that he has given to them for their faithful service. In the same way, we should respond to the faithful service of our ministers by giving. So the priests and Levites, in Numbers 18, the main thrust of this, the whole big chunk of it, is about these contributions and offerings. How they are given to God, and God says, I will give them to you. Remember, the priests and Levites don't have an inheritance in the land. They're not going to be farmers that can provide for themselves. They're going to serve. They're going to serve in the temple. And so how are they going to live? God says, your inheritance is going to be me, and I'm going to give you the stuff that the people are giving me. So the priests are given the offerings, they're given the contributions, and the Levites are given the tithe. So this assumes that people are going to keep worshiping God, though, right? That the people are going to obey, that they're going to give their tithes, that they're going to make offerings and sacrifices and contributions. If they don't give to God, then the priests and Levites won't be able to survive, won't be able to serve in the temple. The priest can't serve in the temple. That means no one's making atonement for the people. And you're back to square one with people being like, no one can approach God, we're all going to die, right? So there is this cycle, this pattern that the people need the priests and the priests need the people, and they need everybody to be worshiping God in obedience. This happened in Israel's history where the people didn't give. The people turned away from God. In Malachi, God says to the people of Israel, he says, will man rob God? Yet you are robbing me. But you say, how have we robbed you? And he says, in your tithes and contributions. You are cursed with a curse, for you are robbing me, the whole nation of you. So this is a big deal. They were robbing God by not bringing these contributions. It's a sin against God. and therefore the priesthood couldn't do what they needed to do as well. So also we need to see that the offerings and contributions weren't actually seen as wages for the priest. They're consecrated things devoted to God, and they're holy. They're things like thanksgiving offerings. They were given in repentance and obedience to God, and then God in turn uses them to support the worship and the ministry, the service that's going on in the temple, which he's providing for the people. So when people didn't give, they're actually robbing God of worship to himself, not just not paying their priests. And it shows the state of their faith and their hearts. And so what about us today? There isn't any New Testament rules that designate you must give this much, these tithes, these are mandatory offerings that Christians have to give, and yet these principles of the Old Testament apply today. And there are several passages that people bring up, that Paul brings up, that makes it clear that we should be providing for people who serve in the church. And sometimes I think we find this a little bit tricky and hard to talk about and weird to talk about to pay pastors and ministers. But why is that? We understand paying someone to fix our car, or paying for a house cleaner, or paying money for food at the store, or even for paying for a security for our home business, or even paying for non-physical things like going to a psychologist or a counselor. But why is it funky and weird to talk about someone who is caring for our souls, who is caring for us spiritually and doing the work of ministry, the worship that we all know is just as important part of us? So Paul pointed to the Old Testament principles to defend that ministers of the gospel should receive support from those they minister to. In 1 Corinthians 9:13 and 14, it says, "Do you not know that those who are employed in the temple service get their food from the temple, and those who serve at the altar share in the sacrificial offerings? In the same way, the Lord commanded that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel." So, an application from this text is simple. Pay your pastors. Or, more accurately, probably give to God. Because God is the one who provides for the pastors and elders through that giving of his people, through this act of worship that we do. You don't need to give out of obligation or guilt or pressure or because I said so, but because giving is part of your worship in grateful response to God providing for you, right? He's provided his high priest, and he's provided these people who are ministering to you, sharing the gospel, proclaiming who God is, guarding the doctrine. Your giving is to God. Your giving shows your heart, your faithfulness in response to God, and how you know he's made a way for you to draw near. The tithe itself shows that the people trusted God, right? They gave the best of their produce, the best of their land to God. And so when we give, it shows we trust God. We don't need to keep everything for ourselves and worry. If we're giving back to God, we're realizing he's given me everything anyway, so I can trust him. I can give him my best. And we see that principle is modeled not just in all the tribes, but the Levites themselves were supposed to tithe from the tithe. They were supposed to give the best, and that went to the priests. So everyone is part of this process of giving to God in worship and God providing through that. So pay your pastors because God has provided by giving them to you. Lastly, live purified. This brings us to our final chapter, Numbers 19 and the waters for impurity. So what was the problem again? The cry of the people is, we're all going to die, we're all undone, anyone who draws near is going to perish. So remember that. That's still the problem they're facing, and God has provided. He said, I've got the priest for you, the high priest. I've given you the priests and Levites to guard. And lastly, we have this water for purification. So remember that way back in Numbers, we were looking at the uncleanness that came from people who were dead. From touching a dead person made you unclean. And if you were unclean, you defiled the camp, you defiled God's tabernacle and brought wrath upon you. And remember what just happened in number 16? 14,700 people are dead, all around them. The pollution and uncleanness created by these corpses would have made so many of them unclean. Think of the process of having to deal with these bodies. Think of the people who were related, the mourning. They're coming into contact with so many, and that uncleanness is spreading amongst them. And if they're suddenly coming to the realization that that cuts them off from God, they're like, what are we going to do? All of us are going to perish. We're all unclean. We're defiling the camp. We're going to defile the tabernacle. And so God is addressing that in this chapter. How is he going to protect and provide and solve this problem, make a way for them to keep living in his midst? So unclean, the word there, it's meant to indicate a state that's totally opposite to holiness and fellowship with God. It's something we don't necessarily understand. We don't have this ceremony uncleanness, but it's pointing to that if you were unclean, you couldn't be in this fellowship with God because he was holy. And this Numbers 19:11 through 13 kind of explains the issue a little bit more and the rule more clearly. So we're going to read verse 11. Whoever touches a dead body of any person shall be unclean 7 days. He shall cleanse himself with the water on the 3rd day, and on the 7th day, and so shall be clean. But if he does not cleanse himself on the 3rd day and on the 7th day, he will not become clean. Whoever touches a dead person, the body of anyone who has died, and does not cleanse himself, defiles the tabernacle of the Lord, and that person shall be cut off from Israel, because the water of impurity was not thrown on him. So anyone who came near to bury these bodies would become unclean. Uncleanness is sticky. It's like grease. I was tasked with cleaning up the grease after we cooked all that roll kuchen at our kickoff, and everything, my rubber gloves, my scrubby was just covered in grease. I was like, someone else put soap on me and sprints me off. Like, uncleanness spread from these dead bodies. And so again, God provides the solution through these burnt ashes of this heifer and the scarlet yarn, the hyssop, the cedar wood. They could add this offering, essentially ingredients of a sin offering, to water, and that water could be sprinkled on these people who are unclean and make them clean again. So though the rituals and sprinkling might seem foreign to us, these ceremonies represented the deeper truth that God can make them clean. He can make you pure so that you will not perish in his presence. And today he's provided an even greater way for us to be made clean. If you looked at the gospel connections, you would have seen that. Why do we need to be cleansed? It's not because we've had association with dead bodies, but because our own sin defiles us. Ephesians 2 says we're not just unclean because of contact with the dead, we are dead. Our sins, our desires, our selfishness makes us unclean. Ephesians 2:12 says that, remember, you were at one time separated from Christ, alienated from the commonwealth, and strangers to the covenants of the promise, having no hope and without God. So just as those who were unclean, and if they weren't cleansed, were cut off, we were cut off. This is the state of all of us, of most of the world, cut off from hope from God because they're unclean. We need miraculous purification, but the ashes of a bull and waters of impurity are not needed for us. In fact, we have something better. Hebrews 9:13 through 14 says, for if the blood of bulls and goats and the sprinkling of a defiled person with the ashes of a heifer sanctify for the purification of the flesh, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, purify our conscience from dead works to serve the living God? So we are purified not just in our flesh, not just so we can come into the camp, but our conscience from dead works to serve God. We're no longer dead. We can come near because we are clean. Does this describe you? Is it your reality? Have you accepted that free gift of God? That free gift of Christ's purifying blood? You can choose that today. And for those of you who have, do you realize what this means? Your conscience is clean. You don't need to live in fear. You don't need to live thinking you need to pay penance for the sins that you've committed in the past. You don't need to drag up those things and feel that guilt again. It is gone. You don't carry guilt in God's eyes. Usually when we pull up that guilt, we cut ourselves off from God by not believing that our conscience is clean. And so if that's something you're struggling with, that you think you've done too much, or how do I make that right? It's clean. You might have to go to people and do some things to sort through and work out relationships, but it's clean. You don't have to do anything to make yourself right with God. His sacrifice lasts forever. so you can live as one purified. Rejoice in the freedom he has given you, and walk out that service to him. Hebrews says you've been purified from your dead works to serve the living God. So do that. Serve him. Live it out. Live purified. So these chapters all come together dealing with the problem of everyone perishing when they draw near to a holy God. But God's priest and his purification protect us from perishing. So we need to trust our priest, pay our pastors out of thanksgiving, and live as purified people.